The first thing I saw was a flash of orange caught in the granite fabric wedged beneath a scatter of sun-bleached stones moving just enough in the high wind to suggest a hand had once placed it there with purpose. Next to it lay a camera with a spider-webbed screen, its metal chilled and dark like it had been waiting years for someone to ask it a question. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Before any of that, my days were simple and almost painfully ordinary. I had just retired from 28 years in a Fresno classroom, the kind of job where you learn the rhythm of a year by locker doors and Friday night football. Mornings started the same way: a travel mug of black coffee, a slow walk to the curb to fetch the paper, the scent of irrigation and dust, and the sound of sprinklers ticking across lawns as the sun pushed the temperature from the low 50s into the 70s by 10 o'clock. I'd wave to the mail carrier I used to trade routes with, tug the porch shade down to cut the glare, and tell myself I was learning how to relax. Sarah belonged to the part of our lives that never needed introduction. She was simply there. On Tuesdays, she swung by after a 12-hour shift, hair pulled back and eyes tired but focused the way medical people carry themselves when they've been tending to the smallest citizens in the hardest moments. She'd sit at our kitchen table where the varnish is worn to a soft shine, eat whatever casserole Janet had coaxed from a recipe card, and talk about weekend plans like they were oxygen. The mountains reset the clock, she'd say, rolling a stretch of tight shoulder with her knuckles. 2 miles in, I can finally breathe. Emma's voice arrived first when they came up the walk, lighter. Quick, always a step ahead. She had the long stride of a runner and a camera that never seemed to leave her hand. She'd snap a photo of our lazy Labrador sprawled across the welcome mat, or of the sun slanting through our oleander hedge, then show me the shot like it was treasure. Teenage energy, but edged with purpose. She measured life in miles and photographs. The four of us, me, Janet, Sarah, and Emma, settled into a routine that year. We held Sunday dinners at 5 sharp the way my parents did. Roast chicken, green beans with slivered almonds, mashed potatoes with a lake of butter. Janet kept a legal pad near her plate like a little command center. There were bills on it, appointment times for the dentist, and below all that, notes labeled trail plans in neat print. Sarah would lean over and add elevation figures, gain 800 feet and distances 5 miles round trip, and Emma would draw a tiny pine tree in the margin just to make her mother smile. I liked being the family's common ground. Sarah and Janet would tease each other the way sisters do, gently, then not so gently, then gently again. When the laughter faded, I'd catch the quiet understanding in their eyes that shared language siblings carry from childhood. After the divorce, the sisters drew even closer. Miguel still called when it was about Emma. Cross-country meets report cards, a birthday budget, but the real scaffolding of life sat at our kitchen table. It always seemed to me that Sarah kept her balance by telling the truth early. She told Emma, "Preparation is respect." She told Janet, "I'll leave a plan at the ranger station, and I'll text you from the trailhead, every time." And she told herself that the wilderness was fair if you met it fair. That October, the first cool nights took the sting out of Fresno's heat. Cottonwoods along the canals turned from green to coin-bright yellow. You could smell wood smoke on back streets where folks started their fireplaces just to hear the crackle. I pulled the long sleeves from storage and swept summer dust off the patio, letting the air cut through the house. We watched the weather like farmers. The forecast promised highs around 65 degrees up high and mornings in the 30s. Good hiking weather, they said. Crisp. On a Tuesday, Sarah and Emma stopped at our place after a quick run to the REI off Blackstone. Emma bounced into the doorway in socks, purple hiking boots looped over her shoulder by the laces. "Birthday boots," she said. Perfect fit, her smile too big to keep. Sarah lifted a new water filter from the canvas tote, the box still sealed, and set it beside Janet's legal pad. She read the fine print without speaking, then set it down in a careful way that I only recognized later when every small motion had meaning. "Cathedral Lakes," Emma announced. before the snow. "We'll be home for a late dinner." She said it like a promise, not a boast. Janet raised an eyebrow the way older sisters do when they know the answer already, but ask the question anyway. "Permits day hike," Sarah said. "I'll file a plan anyway. We'll start early. Sunrise at the trailhead off the high ground before afternoon weather." It was the kind of exchange that made me trust the air in the room. They weren't thrill seekers. They were steady people who treated the Sierra with reverence. Sarah carried a kit that would impress a medic first aid supplies tucked in Ziplocs, a whistle, a compact space blanket, an emergency bivy extra calories shoved into side pockets, a GPS that beeped softly when she checked the breadcrumb trail. Emma kept her own headlamp and a bright orange fleece because her mother insisted. They left printed itineraries with Janet and always called from the car before driving home. That drumbeat of caution became its own comfort. Life in our neighborhood drifted around them like a familiar old song. Friday nights, the high school band warmed up in the distance, and white-helmeted linemen clapped each other on the back beneath stadium lights. On Saturdays, I grilled tri-tip in the backyard lights strung under the eaves of the patio, casting a warm net across the table. When the wind was right, we could hear freight horns from the tracks and the echo of traffic rolling north on Highway 99. At dusk, the valley cooled and everything smelled like earth after irrigation. You live that long in a place, you learn its voice. The week before they planned to go, small things ticked out of place. Our aging Honda began a thin rattle on the passenger side that I meant to look at and didn't. Janet mentioned an orthodontist bill for Emma that arrived out of sequence larger than expected with a date that didn't line up. Nothing dramatic, just a paper out of step. Sarah joked that everything shows up at once in the mail, then rubbed her temple like a woman counting the hours still left in a shift. The next morning, she texted a photo of a sunrise over the hospital parking lot sky washed in pink, the row of staff cars thin and lonely, and wrote, "2 more nights than air that doesn't smell like antiseptic." On the day before they left, I tuned the yard lights to come on earlier because sunset had been creeping in. I remember the small things, the way Janet clipped a new pen to her legal pad, the way Emma held up a headlamp and asked if she should pack extra batteries, just because the way Sarah checked a topo map twice and then once more for no one but herself. They put their packs by the door, Sarah's large blue Osprey that had seen miles, Emma's green day pack, still bright around the zippers. I told myself that families look safest like that prepared present ordinary. We ate early that evening. Sarah stuck to water and grilled chicken. Emma picked through the bowl for the thickest slices of avocado, told me the John Muir Trail turned like a ribbon not far from the lake, and asked if we still had that old emergency blanket in our glove box because she liked how the foil crinkled. I said yes, and then embarrassed myself by reminding her about hydration like I was still lecturing freshmen. She rolled her eyes and smiled and said, "I've got 3 liters and a filter, Uncle Dave." She'd taken to calling me that when she wanted me to stop fussing. They left our house before dark to sleep a few hours at their apartment on Olive Avenue, the one Sarah had turned into a small museum of miles. Photos lined the wall above their couch, alpine water shining like glass granite slabs bathed in the last light of day, the two of them grinning with faces flushed from exertion. I had teased Sarah once that it looked like a modest ranger station, and she'd said, "That's the point." Every picture was a promise they kept to one another. We do hard things, and we do them together. Morning came early. I was up at 4:30 by habit, the way retirement fails to convince your body it's allowed to sleep. The house was dark and square against the cool. In the kitchen, the refrigerator motor hummed a low, familiar drone. I poured coffee into the travel mug I used for decades, the one dented near the base from falling off my desk the year the ductwork rattled loose. I checked the forecast again. Old teachers never stopped checking the weather and liked what I saw. Clear skies on the east side, light wind highs in the mid-60s up top. I took a sip, then another, and felt the warm creep into my hands. At 6 on the dot, Janet's phone chimed softly on the counter. A message from Sarah Rout, start time intended turnaround, and a request so polite it read like an apology. Keep the porch light on. Might be late. Janet wrote back what she always wrote. Copy. Call from the car. She added a heart because sisters say more than logistics. The day lifted. I ran a couple of errands, picked up a new rake head, grabbed milk, chatted 3 minutes with a former student who introduced me to his toddler in a tiny ball cap. I came home to find Janet sorting the mail, the orthodontist bill still there, but now paper-clipped to a note in her neat hand with the correct figures. She kept busy in a way that looked like calm until you knew her. I asked, "You okay?" and she said, "They'll be fine," as if speaking it out loud made the air hold it. By late afternoon, the slant of light across our street turned long and golden. I rolled the trash barrel to the curb and stopped for a second to listen. You could hear a neighbor's lawnmower die a child's shout, heads up in a driveway basketball game, the clink of someone setting a casserole on a cooling rack. Underneath all that, there was the valley quiet, a big sound like distance itself. I washed my hands, set the table, and placed my phone screen up near the salt because I wanted to see it light the moment it rang. Sometime after 7, the air slipped down into the low 60s. I stepped onto the porch and tugged the light chain once, twice, until the bulb steadied. The glass warmed my palm. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching dust drift in the cone of light and the occasional moth tap the fixture with a soft, papery sound. It's an old habit from my father. The porch light means safe harbor, come home, we're up. Janet dried a plate and set it carefully in the cabinet, listening the way a person does when the house is quiet and she doesn't want to admit she's waiting. She crossed the room and checked her phone again. A single notification sat on the lock screen routine, not urgent. She cleared it with her thumb and set the device face down, as if turning away from something would slow it. I refolded the dish towel. Out on Olive Avenue, the streetlights would be flicking on. Up high in the Sierra, where granite holds the day a little longer, the last light would be thinning above the peaks. I imagined an orange fleece, bright as a traffic cone in the bruised blue of evening. And then I made myself think of something else, of none of it, because they were careful. They were prepared. They were ours. The porch stayed lit. The house held its breath in that quiet way houses do when they're listening for a familiar set of headlights to round the corner and sweep a soft arc across the living room wall. We waited still and ordinary while the hour hand eased past 8. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and fell silent. Janet lifted her phone, looked at the blank screen, and laid it back down without a word. By 9, I stepped out and pulled the porch light chain one more time, not to shut it off, but to be sure it stayed on. The bulb hummed faintly in the cool air. Inside the table was set the coffee pot, ready to warm the house expectant. We stood at the window with our hands on the sill, listening for a car that didn't turn onto our street. By the time the clock touched 9 that night, the house had gone still in that way that only comes when everyone's pretending not to be waiting. The porch light hummed softly steady in the cool air. Janet had stopped pacing, though her fingers kept tracing the same edge of the counter. I remember glancing at my phone, seeing the empty lock screen, and thinking, not yet. Just not yet. I told myself they'd lost signal, that maybe they'd lingered to watch the sun drop behind the peaks the way Sarah liked to do. Still, there was a weight in my stomach I couldn't explain. It sat there like a stone pressing down. Around 10, Janet called her sister's number again, straight to voicemail. She hung up without saying anything, then tried Emma's, and the same silence answered back. I poured coffee neither of us wanted and said maybe they'd stayed in Tuolumne for the night. Maybe they'd decided to sleep in the car rather than risk driving those narrow mountain roads in the dark. But even as I said it, I could see from her face that she wasn't buying it. And truth be told, neither was I. At a little before 11, she made the call I knew was coming. I stood behind her as she spoke to a ranger on the overnight shift. her voice polite at first, then breaking into that tight, brittle rhythm that means fear is closing in. She gave them the details: trailhead route, return time, the kind of gear they'd packed. The ranger on the line later, I'd learn his name was Michelle Torres, told her they'd send someone to check the parking lot at first light. Janet thanked her, though the words caught in her throat. After she hung up, she just stood there a long while with both hands on the counter, staring at the tile. I turned off the porch light, then turned it right back on. I didn't want that glow gone. Neither of us slept much that night. Every creak in the house, every distant car on Olive Avenue made us sit up and listen. I remember the sound of the refrigerator motor cycling on and off, and how in that small mechanical hum I realized how quiet the rest of the world had become. When the first gray light seeped through the blinds, Janet was already dressed. She didn't say anything, just poured a cup of coffee and stared out the window toward the east, toward those mountains. The ranger called around 7. They'd found Sarah's car, locked, untouched, parked exactly where it should have been. A thermos, a cooler, a pair of scrubs folded neatly in the back seat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to turn worry into dread. The ranger said they were sending a field team up the Cathedral Lakes Trail just to be sure, and that they'd keep us informed. Janet nodded through the phone as if the ranger could see her. When she hung up, she looked at me like she was trying to measure the space between hope and the truth. We drove up to the park that afternoon, a trip I can still see in my mind like a reel of film, the flat sprawl of the valley giving way to the foothills, the road winding tighter as pines grew dense and the air sharpened with altitude. The higher we went, the more the sun turned cold against the windshield. Somewhere past the Yosemite gate, Janet's phone lost signal altogether, and I watched her thumb hover over the screen, useless now. By the time we reached the ranger station near Tuolumne Meadows, a small group was already gathered, volunteers in bright jackets, a canine unit, a search coordinator checking off gear lists on a clipboard. A man with a calm face introduced himself as Ranger Chris Martinez. He said he was heading the ground search for the morning. He'd been the one to locate Sarah's car. I remember his expression, measured professional but not detached. He talked us through what they knew, which wasn't much. The car was fine, the weather had held steady, visibility was good. The last confirmed sighting came from a couple named Martinez as well. No relation who'd passed Sarah and Emma on the trail around 9:30 that morning. They'd said both seemed happy, relaxed, nothing unusual. That was the word he kept using, nothing unusual. But of course, everything about it was unusual now. They let us see the car before they towed it for safekeeping. It sat in the gravel lot like a photograph of normal life. I pressed my hand against the window, half expecting warmth from the sun, but the glass was cold. Inside the coffee thermos was still half full, a fine line of condensation tracing down the metal. There was a single hair elastic looped around the gear shift. Little things, ordinary things made unbearable by what they implied. The search began that same day. 2 teams split the terrain, one following the main road up toward Cathedral Lakes, another veering onto the informal trails that spidered off toward smaller valleys. The dog handler called out commands that echoed against the granite walls and died quickly in the thin air. We watched them go until the colors of their jackets disappeared into the trees. Then there was nothing left to do but wait. By late afternoon, the light shifted and the air cooled. The forest changed sound when the temperature dropped. Even the birds quieted. A helicopter came in low, circling the area, its blades chopping the silence into sharp pieces. We stood outside the ranger station, listening to the thump recede. Janet kept her arms folded tight across her chest, staring at the tree line like she could will her sister back through it. I tried to speak once or twice to remind her that Sarah was resourceful, that Emma knew how to use the whistle and the emergency blanket, but the words fell flat. The truth was, I didn't know what to believe anymore. The next day brought more of the same search teams combing through drainage areas around the lakes across meadows that looked smooth from a distance but hid sinkholes and ankle-deep mud. The dogs picked up faint traces of scent in places too general to mean much. Every report came back the same: no clear sign of distress, no gear, no clothing, no footprints that could be tied to them. It was as if they'd stepped into the air itself. Back home in Fresno, the story spread fast. Local news anchors stood outside the hospital where Sarah worked, interviewing colleagues who described her as careful, dependable, the last person to take risks. Flyers went up with the same two photographs: Sarah standing against a mountain lake, her arm around Emma, both smiling wide. Emma's high school printed those images, too stapled them to corkboards by the gym and the front office. Her coach told reporters she was a fighter built for endurance, too stubborn to give up. I wanted to believe that. God, I did. A week passed, then another. The operation grew larger. County deputies, state rescue specialists, a team with thermal cameras flown in from Sacramento. They scoured the ridges and the shaded basins where sunlight never reached, and still nothing. The news cycles turned from updates to retrospectives. The vanishing at Cathedral Lakes, they called it. People in town started lowering their voices when we walked by. Strangers brought casseroles to our door as if kindness could fill the space where facts should have been. By the seventh day, the official search scaled back. The captain in charge, a man named Stevens, held a small press briefing under a makeshift tent near the ranger station. The wind kept tugging at the corners of his notes. He said they'd covered over 50 square miles, followed every logical path, and found no evidence of foul play or accident. He called it a mystery, though he avoided the word cold. I stood a few paces behind Janet as she stepped forward to speak after him. She thanked the rangers and the volunteers. She said, "My sister and niece are still out there, and we'll keep looking." Her voice didn't shake once. When the first snow hit in mid-November, everything changed. Access roads closed. The park shut down higher elevations. The world we'd been staring into for answers was suddenly buried under a white silence. The calls from the investigators grew less frequent, the tone more formal. The holidays came and went in a haze of half-finished dinners and unopened cards. Janet kept Sarah's apartment exactly the same. I'd drive her there every couple of weeks so she could check the mail and water the plants, but she never stayed long. She said it felt like a waiting room that wouldn't end. Sometimes at night I'd hear her in the kitchen, the faint click of her laptop keys as she searched forums and blogs about missing hikers. People shared theories, some kind, some cruel. She'd scroll until dawn, then close the lid quietly as though shutting out the noise could bring her peace. I'd find her sitting in the dark, hands clasped like she was holding something fragile. They were too careful, she'd whisper once in a while. Too careful for this to make sense. By spring, the case had slipped into that gray area where hope and resignation live side by side. The sheriff's office still returned calls, but slowly. The leads had thinned out. There were always stories about a footprint here or a forgotten campsite there, but they never led anywhere. Sometimes I'd drive past the hospital and see the banner still hanging by the entrance, missing Sarah Chen and daughter Emma. The edges had started to fray from the wind, the faces fading a little more each week. I tried to fill the days with normal chores, yard work, small repairs around the house, but it never stuck. Every sound reminded me of waiting: the hum of a car engine idling at dusk, the soft ping of a phone notification. We both lived in that pause. Janet's sister's birthday came around in June, and she baked a cake anyway. Just 2 candles, one for Sarah and one for Emma. She didn't say a word while the wax melted down. Then on the first anniversary of their disappearance, she organized a vigil at the hospital's meditation garden. It was a calm evening, warm, still the kind of air that holds sound softly. Hundreds came: nurses, teachers, classmates, people who didn't even know them. Everyone held a candle, and when the wind caught the flames, the whole crowd moved their hands to shield them at once like a single gesture of defiance. Janet spoke last. She said they had walked into the wilderness they loved, and that somewhere in those mountains the truth was waiting. That night, after the crowd drifted away, I found her sitting in the car, staring out at nothing. She said almost to herself, "They're still out there. The mountains don't keep secrets forever." I didn't know then how right she'd be, because nearly 3 years later a call would come that changed everything. 2 climbers on Half Dome had stumbled across something bright under the granite, something that the wind had been tugging at for years, waiting for someone to notice. When the phone rang that morning in late September of 2022, I almost didn't answer. It was early, not even 7, and the light coming through the blinds still had that washed-out look of late summer, half gray, half gold. Janet was standing at the stove making oatmeal, the kind she never ate, just stirred out of habit. I could tell by the sound of her breath that she'd already been up for hours. The call came from an area code I didn't recognize. Yosemite Dispatch, the display read, and before she even picked up, she froze. I could see her hand tighten on the phone, and I knew something had shifted. The voice on the other end was calm, practiced. A ranger. He said a pair of climbers on Half Dome had reported finding what looked like personal gear in a remote spot. Clothing, hiking equipment, maybe a camera. They'd marked the location, and rangers were already en route. The description was vague, but when he mentioned an orange jacket, Janet leaned against the counter as though the air had gone out of her lungs. I took the phone from her and listened to the rest coordinates, weather conditions, retrieval timeline, but the words blurred together. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah and Emma disappeared, and now just like that, something had surfaced. We drove up that afternoon mostly in silence. The road felt both familiar and foreign. The same steep turns, the same cracked asphalt winding through miles of forest. But the weight in the car made it different this time. Janet held a manila folder in her lap, one she'd kept since the early days, copies of maps, Sarah's hiking itinerary, photos of Emma smiling against granite peaks. I'd seen her open it hundreds of times, but this time she didn't look inside. She just rested her hand over it like it was fragile. At the ranger station, the air smelled of pine and dust and jet fuel. A helicopter had just come in from a short flight. Its blades still ticked faintly as they slowed. We were met by Detective Sarah Martinez, the same investigator who had stayed in touch over the years. She led us inside a small office where a wall map of Yosemite hung dotted with red circles and pencil marks tracing search routes from long ago. Her tone was careful, but there was something underneath it, urgency mixed with relief. 2 experienced climbers had been scaling a route near the summit of Half Dome when they'd stumbled onto what they described as a pocket in the rock, a kind of depression shielded from the main trail. Inside, they'd found an orange fleece, a hiking pole with purple grips, and a weather-damaged camera wedged between stones. Janet didn't say anything. She just stared at the photograph they'd printed grainy, taken on a phone, but clear enough to make out the color of the fabric. It was the same shade Sarah had insisted Emma wear for safety, so she could be seen even against the grayest sky. The detective said a recovery team was already on site documenting every inch before disturbing anything. They'd send the items to a forensic lab in Sacramento that night. When the door closed behind her, Janet whispered, "That's her jacket." Not a question, not disbelief, just certainty. I reached for her hand, but she didn't take it. By evening, we were given permission to see the recovered items in person. They'd been laid out carefully in evidence trays, faded from sunlight, edges frayed from years of wind. The orange fleece was torn at one sleeve, the fabric stiff like parchment. The hiking pole's rubber grip had cracked, and a thin line of dirt marked where a hand might have once held it. But it was the camera that drew everyone's attention. It was small black. The lens shattered, but the memory card looked intact. I remember the technician's gloved fingers turning it over under the light, her expression a mix of curiosity and reverence, as if she knew she was holding the last record of 2 lives. The ranger who'd coordinated the response, Chris Martinez, the same man who'd found Sarah's car 3 years earlier, walked us through the site description. The climbers had been off their usual route, exploring a depression about 4 miles northwest of Cathedral Lakes, hidden from view by ridgelines and boulder fields. The spot was so secluded that even experienced search teams could have missed it easily, especially under changing light. The ground there was uneven, pocked with small crevices where runoff had carved narrow channels through the stone. One of the climbers, a man named Marcus Chen, no relation to Sarah, had recognized the significance right away. He'd been part of volunteer search efforts in 2019. Listening to that, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. The idea that another man with the same name had helped bring this moment to us, somehow it felt poetic and cruel at once. Janet asked when we'd know more about what was on the camera. The detective said the card was already being transported under chain of custody, that digital forensics experts would start working immediately. "If the data's recoverable," she said softly, "we'll have a clearer picture of their final hours." That night, we stayed in a small motel outside the park. The air was thin and smelled faintly of cedar smoke. Janet lay on the bed, eyes open, not sleeping, just staring at the textured ceiling. Every few minutes, headlights from the road would sweep across the room, flashing over her face, and then vanishing. I sat by the window, watching the dark shapes of the mountains. For the first time in 3 years, I could almost see a line between then and now, between loss and understanding. But lines like that don't hold for long. 2 days later, the detective called. They'd managed to extract images from the memory card, 127 in total. Most were ordinary hiking scenes, landscapes, selfies of Sarah and Emma smiling against the sky. But near the end of the sequence, the tone changed. The final photos, she said, showed unfamiliar terrain, steep granite walls, dense brush angles, suggesting a narrow canyon or ravine. The timestamps indicated the pictures were taken late in the afternoon of October 15th, hours after Sarah's last text to Janet. In one image, Sarah appeared to be pointing at something outside the frame. In another, Emma's hand reached toward the lens as if to adjust it or block glare. The last photo was almost entirely black, just faint reflections of light, possibly from a flashlight or the setting sun. I asked her what it meant. She said they were still analyzing, matching the geology in those frames to known areas of the park. "It's progress," she told me. "We finally have evidence of where they might have gone off trail." Janet didn't speak for a long time after hearing that. When she finally did, her voice was barely a whisper. "So they were alive for hours," she said. "They made it that far." She rubbed her hands together slowly, as if trying to warm them. They were trying to find their way back. The days that followed blurred into interviews, updates, and quiet waiting. Forensic teams examined the fabric of the fleece and found traces of sediment consistent with the half-dome plateau. They found cut rope fibers suggesting deliberate use, maybe to secure themselves or mark a path. Nothing pointed to foul play. Everything pointed to disorientation, exhaustion, and effort. That last part stayed with me, the effort. At one point, a forensic specialist, a woman named Dr. Walsh, explained that the placement of the gear suggested intent. The jacket had been weighed down by rocks, not discarded by accident. It might have been meant as a signal to rescuers. The hiking pole was near a flat area that could have served as a temporary shelter. It painted a picture not of panic, but of people thinking, planning, doing everything they could. When she said that, Janet closed her eyes. "That's Sarah," she murmured. "That's exactly what she'd do." In the following weeks, search teams returned to the area with new mapping technology, drones, ground-penetrating radar-specialized climbers who could navigate the fractures and gullies where water pooled and light barely reached. The terrain was harder than anyone had imagined, full of hidden drop-offs and loose stone that could swallow evidence for years. Each new scan came back with data, but no human remains, just the echo of what had once happened there. Back home, life narrowed again. Janet spent her evenings rereading the reports, highlighting phrases like possible drainage route and exposure consistent with October weather patterns. I tried to keep the house steady, meals, bills, small routines, but she was somewhere else, living half in the present and half in those recovered photographs. Sometimes, in the quiet between us, I'd imagine what that day must have felt like for them. The light fading, the cold coming in. Sarah keeping her voice steady for Emma's sake. The girl still taking pictures because that's what she did. Documented everything, even the hard parts. One night near the end of October, Janet asked me something that's never left me. "Do you think they knew?" she said. That nobody was coming in time, I didn't know how to answer. The truth was, maybe they did. But maybe they didn't let that truth in. Maybe they just kept moving one careful step at a time, believing that if they followed the sound of running water or the line of the ridge, they'd find their way out. When we met with Detective Martinez again later that month, she told us the investigation was officially reclassified from a disappearance to a probable accident pending recovery. It wasn't the closure people think you want. Closure is neat clean. This wasn't. This was a door left half open, the wind still moving through. She promised they'd continue searching as long as the weather allowed and that every new lead would be pursued. Before we left, she pulled a small envelope from her desk and handed it to Janet. Inside was a print of one of the recovered photographs, Sarah and Emma standing side by side at Upper Cathedral Lake, both smiling, unaware of what was coming. The light on their faces was soft, the kind you only get in late morning at high elevation. Janet held it close, tracing their outlines with her thumb. "They look happy," she said quietly. "They look like they were where they belonged." Driving home that evening, I watched the sky darken over the valley. The mountains were still out there, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. Somewhere up there was the place where those photos ended, where a mother and daughter did everything right and still vanished into the wild. I kept my eyes on the horizon as we drove, thinking about all the people who disappear into quiet corners of this world, and the few who are found by accident years later when the wind decides to uncover something. When we pulled into the driveway, Janet didn't get out right away. She just sat there, hands in her lap, looking at nothing. "I used to think not knowing was the worst part," she said finally. "But now that we do, it still feels like the same silence." I didn't have an answer for her. I just turned off the headlights and let the night settle around us. Somewhere in a lab in San Francisco, technicians were still studying those final images frame by frame, hoping for one more clue hidden in the shadows. And out there, beyond the reach of light, the mountains waited quiet, unbothered, keeping their last secrets until someone came looking again. The next few weeks felt like moving through water, every sound a little slower, every light a little duller. The world kept spinning, but ours didn't. Most days began with a phone call from the investigators, short and methodical. Updates about lab work, mapping overlays, weather delays. Each one was meant to bring clarity, but instead they left us suspended between knowing and not knowing. It was late October when Detective Martinez asked us to come back to the ranger station. She said there were findings from the digital recovery team that we should hear in person. Her tone was careful. That word "findings" hung between us the whole drive north. The air was crisp when we arrived, the first real bite of cold that year. Pine needles carpeted the road, and a storm was coming down from the higher passes, thickening the clouds until they pressed low over the valley. Inside the ranger outpost, the lights felt too bright. On the table sat a folder thick with printed photographs and notes. I could see the edge of a single image peeking out from under the stack, Sarah's blue jacket against a backdrop of granite. Janet's hand tightened around mine. Martinez didn't waste time with small talk. She said they'd been able to recover all but a few of the photos from Emma's camera, and what they'd pieced together painted a clearer picture of those final hours. She spread the prints across the table in order like stepping stones. The first half were what you'd expect: morning light on the trail, a doe crossing the path, a mother and daughter smiling at the edge of a lake that looked like glass. You could feel the warmth in those shots, the comfort of routine. But then, midway through, the tone shifted. The sky darkened slightly, the angles tilted, and something in Sarah's posture changed. Her shoulders drawn, her hand pointing toward a direction out of frame. Martinez said the timestamps placed these photos around midday, about an hour after the last known sighting. The terrain behind them wasn't on the official trail. It was steeper, broken by loose rock and shadowed ledges. The later photos came fast, close together, as if Emma had been snapping instinctively. You could almost feel the rush in them, the blur of movement, the uneven ground. In one, Sarah's face was turned toward her daughter, her mouth mid-sentence expression tight like she was trying to stay calm. The next was nothing but a smear of gray. The one after that, Emma's hand reaching toward the lens, her wrist catching the light. Then the final image, darkness, faint beams cutting through like reflections. Forensic analysts believed it was the beam of a headlamp or flashlight against wet granite. The timestamp was just after 4:30 that afternoon. That meant they'd still been alive, still fighting to find their way back long after we thought they were gone. Janet didn't cry. She leaned forward, studying the last photo so closely that her breath fogged the plastic sleeve. "They were underground?" she asked quietly. Martinez said they couldn't be sure, possibly in a ravine, maybe a narrow canyon that had trapped them. There were no visible landmarks, just walls and water stains. But the geologists who'd studied the images thought the rock formations looked like the kind found in drainage systems west of Cathedral Lakes, the same general area where the equipment had been recovered. The detective's voice softened. They were moving with purpose, she said, not panicking. They were still trying to get out. That word, trying, lodged deep in me. You live with uncertainty for years, and then suddenly you're staring at proof that they didn't vanish. They struggled, they endured. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It was heavier somehow. We asked about the cut rope and the jacket, the way the items were arranged. Martinez said the rope had been severed cleanly, not torn by force. It might have been used to secure something, a makeshift anchor, maybe an attempt to climb or descend. The orange fleece had been weighed down by stones, possibly to mark a location or signal for help. Everything about the scene suggests they were thinking clearly, she told us. They were doing everything right. On the drive home, Janet stared out the window. The road twisted through the foothills, switchback after switchback, headlights sweeping over the rocks. After a long silence, she said, "They didn't give up." Her voice wasn't broken or even sad. It was steady, almost proud. Sarah would have told her to stay calm, to keep moving. She always said the mountains reward patience. I nodded, though the word stuck in my throat, because patience hadn't been rewarded. It had only drawn the moment out. Over the next month, the park brought in specialized teams to search the terrain around Half Dome again. New technology, drones, thermal imaging, ground-penetrating radar tools that hadn't been available in 2019. They scanned drainages, narrow cracks, hidden ledges where water collected and then froze. Each day they brought back data, but never the one thing that mattered most. I went up there once with them standing at the edge of a granite drop-off while the wind came up from the valley, sharp and dry. You could see forever from that height, ridges rolling away like waves, but down in the shadows, everything vanished into gray. That was where Sarah and Emma had walked, where the light had failed them. I remember thinking how thin the line is between safety and disaster, how quickly a wrong turn can erase everything familiar. By winter, snow sealed the park again. Search operations halted until spring. Janet and I returned home and tried to fold the new information into our lives like another layer of unfinished truth. The images were proof, but they weren't closure. They showed us effort, not ending. Still, the discovery changed something. The public story shifted from mystery to tragedy, from rumor to understanding. Reporters called it the Cathedral Lakes case solved, though it wasn't. But people needed a shape to put around their fear. The months that followed were strange. There were fundraisers, interviews, letters from strangers who said they'd hiked those same trails and now saw them differently. The hospital where Sarah worked started a wilderness safety program in her named training staff in first aid and survival skills for outdoor emergencies. Emma's old classmates held a small ceremony at the high school track, planting a dogwood tree near the finish line where she used to run. They called it the Emma Mile, a race they'd repeat every spring. I stood beside Janet, watching the students start their laps, bright shirts cutting across the field, the sound of their sneakers like rain against the asphalt. I could feel the mix of pride and grief settling in my chest, the knowledge that her spirit had outlived the body, but the body was still missing. Every so often, Detective Martinez would call with updates, new leads, expanded searches. She kept her promise to keep looking even when the chances dwindled. In one of those calls, she told me about something small but unexpected. Forensic analysts had enhanced the darker portions of Emma's final photo and found faint traces of what might be running water-thin vertical streaks along the rock mineral staining consistent with a seasonal stream. It could mean they'd been near a hidden drainage channel, maybe even a cavern system beneath the granite. It's not much, she said, but it's another place to look. The following spring, crews returned to that sector. They mapped new ground, climbing down into fissures that had been inaccessible before. The work was dangerous, slick stone, loose debris, but the teams moved slowly, methodically. One afternoon, a ranger radioed in about finding a small fragment of blue nylon webbing embedded in the rock. It matched the brand of Sarah's backpack. The fragment was sun-bleached, torn by time, but unmistakable. It wasn't enough to confirm a location, but it was enough to focus the search. They called the area the Hidden Basin. When we visited in late May, the snowmelt had turned the creeks into rivers. We stood near the rim where the ground dropped sharply into a tangle of boulders and narrow chasms. Down below, rangers in helmets moved like colored dots between the stones, their voices rising faintly with the wind. Janet held the photograph of Sarah and Emma at Cathedral Lake, the one the detective had given her months earlier. She said she wanted to bring it to where they'd last been to let the mountains have a piece of it. She knelt near the edge and laid it down on a flat rock, anchoring it with a small stone. The paper fluttered once, then settled. She didn't cry. Neither of us did. The silence around us was too vast for tears. After that trip, I started to dream about them, not in the way I used to, not as ghosts or unfinished business. In the dreams, they were always walking steady, side by side. Sometimes there was light ahead, sometimes just the sound of wind through trees. I'd wake before they reached wherever they were going, but the feeling stayed. Not fear, not sorrow, just a kind of peace I couldn't explain. By summer, it had been nearly 4 years since their hike, and though the park's official report listed the case as presumed fatal accident, the investigation remained open. New search techniques were still being tested. One ranger told me they'd started using aerial LiDAR scans to chart hidden contours of the granite, every ridge, every hollow, every shadowed line. The mountains keep their secrets, he said, but we're getting better at listening. When he said that, I thought about Sarah's words years ago when she first took Emma hiking. The mountains don't judge, she used to say. They just ask for respect. It was meant as a lesson about humility, about preparing and paying attention. But standing there that day, looking out over the vast silence, I heard it differently. Maybe she'd understood something the rest of us only learned too late, that nature doesn't owe us safety, only beauty, and sometimes the two can't live together. That night back home, I found Janet sitting at the kitchen table again, the same table where so many of these moments had begun. A single lamp burned beside her, casting a soft pool of light over her hands. In front of her was a notebook, her way of keeping the story straight. Dates, locations, phone numbers, everything in tidy columns. She looked up when I came in. They found nothing new today, she said. Her voice was tired, but there was no defeat in it. But they're still searching. She closed the notebook and pressed her palm against the cover. We'll keep looking too. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the window, a train horn echoed faintly, the kind that drifts for miles before fading. I stood there listening to it fade, thinking about all the searches that never end, the kind measured not in miles but in years, in the quiet persistence of love refusing to let go. It was then I realized that stories like this don't end with answers. They end with endurance. And sometimes, if you're lucky, endurance itself becomes a kind of grace. A week later, another call came from the park. The tone was different this time, lower, quieter. The ranger didn't give details over the phone, only asked if we could come in person. I remember looking at Janet, her face unreadable, and feeling that same old chill run through me. Something had shifted again. We packed a small bag and left before dawn, the headlights cutting through the fog on the highway, both of us silent. We didn't know it yet, but what waited at the end of that drive would finally tell us where Sarah and Emma had stopped, and how their story after so many years had left one last trace beneath the granite. The drive back to Yosemite that morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy enough to press against the windows. The ranger hadn't said much on the phone, just that new evidence had been located in the same drainage basin they'd searched months earlier. Janet didn't ask questions. She just nodded once when I told her we should go. We packed nothing but water and a small overnight bag. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew this might be the end of the search. The sun hadn't fully broken through when we reached the park boundary. Mist hung in low bands between the pines, and the air had that sharp edge that comes before winter. When we pulled up to the ranger station, Detective Martinez was already outside, hands in her jacket pockets, her expression somewhere between solemn and steady. She didn't lead us inside this time. Instead, she gestured toward the open field beyond the lot, where a helicopter waited with its blades idling slow. "It's better if I show you," she said. The flight was short, 15 minutes, maybe less, but it felt longer. The forest below stretched in endless greens and browns, each ridge folding into another. From above, the land looked peaceful, almost untouched. You'd never guess how many people had combed those slopes, searching for traces of 2 missing hikers. When we landed near the basin, the noise from the blades faded, and for a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Martinez guided us down a narrow trail marked by orange flags. The ground was uneven, slick with damp moss. As we rounded a curve, a cluster of figures came into view, rangers in yellow jackets kneeling near a shallow rock overhang. The air was cold enough to turn each breath visible. A small perimeter of tape surrounded the site. On the far side, beneath a ledge of granite, lay what remained of 2 people who had fought longer than anyone had realized. I won't describe the scene in detail. Some things belonged to the silence that found them. What mattered was the confirmation gear that matched Sarah's. A scrap of fabric from Emma's jacket, the hiking pole recovered months earlier, now aligned with where it had likely fallen. Nearby, half buried under stone, they found a small bundle wrapped in weatherproof fabric. Inside were items packed carefully, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and the emergency blanket we'd once joked about. Even after everything, it was still folded neat. Martinez spoke softly as she explained the sequence their analysts believed had unfolded. The 2 had likely become trapped in the drainage system after losing daylight. The terrain there was deceptive steep, but not sheer a place that promised a shortcut until the ground gave way. They'd sheltered under the ledge, used their gear to stay warm, left markers in case rescuers passed by. Forensic analysis showed no sign of violence, no evidence of struggle beyond the elements. They did everything right, she said again, the same words she'd told us months before. They just ran out of time. Janet knelt by the rock ledge and rested her hand against the stone. Her eyes didn't move from the ground, but her voice was steady. She found shelter, she whispered. She found a way to protect her. There was no collapse, no wailing, just that quiet, almost reverent tone of a woman who had spent years preparing herself for this exact moment. The recovery took most of the day. I stood back watching the methodical precision of it all. Bag-sealed evidence, logged photos taken from every angle. There was something deeply human in the care those rangers took, as if they understood that this wasn't just procedure. It was a homecoming of sorts. When they carried the remains up the slope, Janet walked beside them. Her hand brushed the stretcher, once a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. I saw Martinez glance at her and then look away, giving her that moment of privacy. Back at the ranger station, they gave us space in a small room while the reports were finalized. The sun had begun to set, and the window glass glowed faintly gold. Janet stared outside for a long time before finally speaking. "I always thought I'd feel angry," she said quietly. "At the park, at fate, at something. But I don't. I just miss them." Her voice caught slightly, and she laughed at herself for it. "You think you prepare for grief, but you don't. You just learn to live alongside it." In the weeks that followed, arrangements were made. DNA confirmed the remains beyond doubt. The coroner listed the cause of death as exposure and hypothermia. There were no ceremonies, no formalities beyond that, just the small gathering at the hospital chapel where Sarah had spent so many nights caring for other people's children. Her co-workers filled the front rows in scrubs and hiking boots, candles flickering on the altar beside photos of her and Emma smiling at Cathedral Lake. It was the same picture the Rangers had found on the camera, printed large enough that their joy filled the space. Afterward, Janet and I drove to the foothills one last time, carrying 2 small urns. The park had given us permission to scatter part of the ashes near the trailhead, the same one they'd started from. We went early before the tourists arrived. The morning was cool, the air thin and still. Janet opened the first urn and let the wind take it, the ashes drifting upward before dissolving into the light. Then she opened the second and held it close to her chest for a moment before releasing it too. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in the quiet of those years. In the months that followed, life didn't so much return to normal as it settled into a different shape. Janet retired from teaching and started volunteering with a local search and rescue support group, helping families organizing supply drives, writing safety checklists. It was her way of keeping purpose tethered to pain. I helped where I could, though mostly I just kept her company. Sometimes we'd drive back up to the mountains for no reason, just to sit by the trailhead and listen to the wind move through the trees. There's a kind of peace up there that doesn't belong to words. Detective Martinez stayed in touch not out of obligation but out of kinship. She said the case had changed how the park trained its rangers, how they monitored solo hikers and day trips. The recovered camera and photos became part of a training archive, a quiet teaching tool about preparation, persistence, and the thin line between adventure and risk. She told me once, "We can't make the wilderness safe, but we can make it understood." I think Sarah would have liked that. The hospital scholarship in Emma's name grew faster than anyone expected. Donations came in from people all over the state, parents, teachers, strangers who'd followed the story online. Each year now, a graduating senior from her old high school gets a grant to study environmental science or pediatric nursing fields that reflect both sides of their lives. I go to the ceremony when I can. The students always thank the committee and smile for pictures not fully realizing the history behind the name on the certificate. But that's all right. The fact that her name keeps moving forward is enough. As for me, I think about them most in the small hours before sunrise when the world's still blue and quiet. That's when I can almost hear their laughter echo off the granite carried by wind down into the valleys. It's strange how memory works. It softens the edges, but never erases the outline. The sharp grief dulls, but the shape of love stays. Sometimes when we're driving through the foothills and the sky opens wide, Janet will point toward the ridge and say, "That's where they found peace." And I believe her. Years later, people still stop me in town, ask if the story is true, if they ever found the hikers who vanished near Cathedral Lakes. I tell them yes, but I also tell them something else, that they were never really lost, not in the way people mean it, because from the first day they disappeared, there was a trail of care stretching behind them, family, friends, strangers who refused to give up. That's the part the news never captures. The search isn't just about finding bodies. It's about the quiet courage of those who keep looking long after hope becomes habit. Sometimes I wonder what that last evening felt like for Sarah and Emma, the cold closing in the sky dimming the two of them side by side. I like to believe Sarah told her daughter a story, maybe about the first time they hiked that trail together, or how every sunrise meant another chance to try again. I like to think they faced the dark the same way they faced everything else together, hand in hand, steady. It's been years now, and still the mountains keep their silence. But if you stand at the edge of Cathedral Lake at dawn, when the water's calm and the light is new, you can see their reflection in the surface for just a moment before it disappears, a reminder that some stories don't end, they just settle into the landscape. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever walked through a quiet place and felt that pull in your chest like something sacred still lingers there, let me know where you're listening from. Every voice helps keep their memory alive.